On a quiet evening in Boston, the echo of loss lingered within an old house filled with memories. Madeline Harper, a young woman chasing her dream of becoming a doctor, believed that her grandfather's love and legacy would always be her guiding light. But when the will was read, everything changed. A single condition shattered her certainty, forcing her onto a path she had never imagined, a path where duty, silence, and an unexpected bond would collide in ways no one could foresee. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. If this story touches you, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support is what keeps these stories alive and reaching more hearts every day. Boston carried the sound of winter, even as spring tried to break through. The streets were slick with melting snow. The harbor's salt hung sharp in the air, and the trees, still bare, stood like silent witnesses to every passing step. That morning, the Harper house was quieter than usual, almost suffocatingly so. Inside, Madeline Harper sat in the old leather armchair that had once belonged to her grandfather. Its worn surface held the faint scent of tobacco and the aftershave he always wore. She pressed her fingertips into the armrest as if that simple pressure could draw him back into the room. But the truth remained, cold and immovable. Charles Harper, the man who had raised her, the man who had been her anchor in every storm, was gone. Madeline was only 23, but grief has a way of adding years to a soul. She could still hear his voice lingering in the hallways, soft yet steady, telling her about his first surgeries, about the patients he had saved, about the weight and privilege of holding another person's heart in your hands. He had been one of Boston's most respected cardiologists, but to Madeline he had simply been her grandfather, her family, her whole world. Her mother's absence was a wound that had never fully healed. When Madeline was just a child, her mother had left, disappearing into a life with no room for responsibility or for the fragile little girl she abandoned. Madeline had cried for months, asking why, and it was Charles who carried her through the darkness, giving her a home built not on luxuries, but on presence, warmth, and purpose. He had promised her that she would never be truly alone. Now, as the house settled into its heavy silence, that promise felt like a delicate memory, splintering in her chest. The funeral had been crowded. Patients, colleagues, neighbors, each with a story about Charles Harper's brilliance. But to Madeline, the eulogies felt like waves breaking against rock. Nothing could touch the hollowness inside her, the sharp edge of realizing that every hallway, every photograph, every book on the shelf had become a reminder of absence. She slipped into his study, the room she used to sneak into as a child. It still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Papers were stacked with his careful precision. Medical journals lined the shelves in perfect rows, and on his desk sat a framed photo of little Madeline, hand in hand with him outside the hospital. He had called her his little heartbeat. With trembling fingers, she traced the frame. The silence pressed against her until she whispered, "I'll make you proud, Grandpa. I'll finish what I started. I'll be the doctor you believed I could be." Her vow hung in the air like a thread of light. But promises didn't pay tuition. She knew the price of medical school, the weight of loans already pressing down on her. Charles had assured her he had made provisions in his will, that she would not have to worry, that she could focus on her studies. And so, days later, she sat in the office of Mr. Albright, the family attorney. He was an older man, with kind, calculating eyes behind round glasses. The room smelled of polished wood and lemon oil, heavy curtains letting in thin slivers of light that cut across the floor. Madeline clasped her hands tightly and waited. "Your grandfather loved you dearly," Mr. Albright began, shuffling his papers. "He spoke often of your strength and determination. He wanted to make sure nothing would stand in the way of your becoming the physician he knew you could be." Tears stung, but she nodded for him to continue. "There is, however, a condition attached to the inheritance," he said, clearing his throat. Her body went still. A condition? He chose his words with care. Yes, to access the funds your grandfather left for your education and living expenses, you must be married, legally and formally, before your 24th birthday. The words fell into the room like stones. Madeline blinked, lips parting without sound. Married? Before 24, she had just turned 23, less than a year. Her pulse quickened. That doesn't make sense. Why would he? Dr. Harper believed in stability, Mr. Albright said gently. He often said medicine demanded not just skill, but balance. He wanted to ensure you wouldn't face life alone, that you'd have someone reliable by your side. Madeline's mind spun. The man who had taught her independence, who had raised her to be strong and capable, how could he ask this of her? Marriage had never been her priority. Her studies consumed her. Her dream was the focus. Now this condition rose like a wall she had no idea how to climb. So if I don't, she managed. Then the inheritance reverts to the foundation your grandfather supported, Mr. Albright replied. It would fund medical research and scholarships. The room blurred. She thought of unpaid tuition notices tucked in her desk drawer, of the campus cafe shifts she worked just to buy groceries, of nights spent juggling textbooks and exhaustion. Without the inheritance, she couldn't finish medical school. Without it, his legacy might remain unfinished. The office clock ticked loudly, each second pushing her closer to panic. Marriage, not for love, not by choice, but for survival. The thought twisted in her gut. She remembered her mother's abandonment, the chaos of a broken home, the loneliness that had shaped her. Could she willingly step into something that might shatter her all over again? Betrayal, confusion, grief. Her chest ached with all of it. She wanted to ask him why, but Charles was gone. His reasons were sealed inside a heart she could no longer reach. Madeline pressed her palms against her knees to steady herself. As she forced herself to breathe, one truth rose to the surface. Her future now hinged on a decision she had never imagined facing. With a look that bordered on pity, the lawyer slid the papers toward her. You have time, Madeline, but not much. Think carefully. Her eyes dropped to the black ink on the page, her grandfather's signature still bold, still final. It felt like his hand was reaching from beyond the grave, steering her toward a path she didn't want to walk. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since the funeral, fear swelled higher than grief. What kind of life would this force her into? What kind of man could she possibly trust enough to bind herself to under terms like these? And yet, deep down, a thought she didn't want to face began to whisper. What if her grandfather had already chosen someone? The following week passed as if she were walking through fog. Madeline went to her classes, scribbled notes, even nodded politely at professors, as though life were normal, but nothing was. Every breath, every heartbeat carried the echo of her grandfather's condition. Marriage before 24. It haunted her when she tried to sleep, gnawed at her when she tried to study. One evening, the library's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she stared blankly at her anatomy textbook. The words swam until the page blurred. Around her, students whispered, flipped notes, tapped pens. Yet Madeline was trapped in silence. Her friends knew she was grieving, but none of them knew the impossible choice that pressed on her chest. Everywhere she went, on the subway, along Boylston Street, in the hospital cafeteria, she caught herself watching couples. Some laughed easily, some bickered, some held hands, as if the simple gesture meant nothing. Madeline studied them and wondered, could she ever fake this? Could something forced ever become real? Her restless thoughts were interrupted when the phone rang. Mr. Albright's voice came steady, professional, but with an edge of urgency. "Madeline," he said, "there's someone you need to meet." She frowned. "Meet? What do you mean?" "There are details your grandfather arranged before his passing. He left suggestions, a person he trusted." Her stomach clenched. "A person?" "Yes. Doctor. Sebastian Hale. He was both a colleague and a close friend of your grandfather's. You may remember him from your childhood. He visited often. The name stirred a faint memory. A tall man with serious eyes, always dressed in dark suits, untouchable, intimidating. Nurses used to whisper his name in hospital hallways. A brilliant neurosurgeon, cold, distant, respected, but never approached. Your grandfather considered him an ideal candidate, Mr. Albright said carefully. The words pierced her. Ideal candidate, not for love, not for companionship, for stability. She let out a sharp breath. You can't be serious. He's... what? Nearly 40? And I'm 23, the lawyer finished softly. I know this is not what you imagined, but it is what your grandfather left behind. Dr. Hale has agreed to meet with you, nothing more. The rest is your choice. Choice. The word felt cruel. Without the inheritance, her future collapsed. With it, she'd be bound to a man who embodied everything she feared. Control, silence, distance. Yet curiosity, or perhaps desperation, drew her into the meeting. The afternoon was grey when she returned to the law office. Rain tapped against the tall windows, the room smelling faintly of varnish and old paper. Madeline's palms were damp as she followed Mr. Albright into the conference room. And there he was. Dr. Sebastian Hale stood near the window, posture rigid, expression unreadable. His suit was impeccable, his tie perfectly knotted, his presence commanding without a word. When they entered, he turned, his blue-grey eyes settling on her with recognition laced in detachment. For a long moment, no one spoke. The rain filled the silence. Madeline forced herself to greet him. "Dr. Hale." "Madeline," he replied, his voice low, controlled, neither warm nor cruel, just distant. She resisted the urge to retreat, instead lowering herself into the chair across the table. "Mr." Albright busied himself with papers, as though routine could soften the tension. "Your grandfather trusted you both," he said. "He believed that together you could provide each other with balance and support." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "This is absurd." Madeline flinched at the bluntness. Though she couldn't deny, she agreed. "I am a surgeon," Sebastian said flatly. "My life is consumed by my work. I do not entertain distractions. Marriage was never something I intended." The honesty of his words stung. Not cruelty, simply indifference. He had no interest in her, no interest in this arrangement. Madeline's cheeks burned. "You think this is easy for me? You think I want this?" Their eyes clashed, storms colliding, and for the first time she glimpsed something behind his cold exterior, a flicker of frustration, perhaps even vulnerability. Mr. Albright cleared his throat. "Perhaps you might consider this less as marriage in its traditional sense, and more as an agreement, a partnership, purely civil. No expectations beyond the legal requirement. Once Madeline finishes her studies, you would both be free to choose your own futures." The silence stretched. Sebastian turned back toward the rain-streaked glass, his reflection fractured in the pane. Finally he spoke, his voice softer, though still guarded. "I owed your grandfather much. If this was his wish, I will consider it." Madeline's breath caught. Consider it. Not agree, not accept, just consider. She stared at him, her chest heavy with clashing emotions, anger at her grandfather, fear of Sebastian's detachment, and buried deep beneath it all, a flicker of curiosity. What kind of man set aside his own desires for duty? What secrets kept his heart so tightly locked away? The lawyer slid the papers closer. 2 signatures, 2 lives, 1 impossible path. Madeline's hand hovered above the table, the weight of choice pressing harder than ever before. The air in the room felt colder once the words were spoken. An agreement, a partnership. Not a marriage built on affection or choice, but on necessity and legacy. Madeline's mind spun, struggling to grasp the weight of it. Her eyes studied Sebastian's face, calm, unreadable, almost carved from stone. He looked like a man who never lost control, a life measured in precise calculations and locked behind walls no one could breach. And yet, beneath that composure, she sensed something else. A flicker she couldn't quite name. Irritation, maybe even pain. The soft click of Mr. Albright's pen echoed as he prepared the documents, a sound too sharp in the suffocating silence. Madeline folded her arms, staring at the papers as though they were chains waiting to bind her. Finally, she broke the quiet. "If we do this, it won't be real." Sebastian turned his eyes on her, sharp and unwavering. "Real is irrelevant. It will be legal. That is all that matters." The bluntness stung. "So we'll sign the papers, live under the same roof, play the part for everyone else, and nothing more?" His gaze didn't waver. Nothing more. The certainty should have comforted her. Clear boundaries, lowered expectations. Instead, the words pressed against her chest like iron. She remembered her grandfather's voice, teaching her that life was more than survival, that medicine was as much about humanity as knowledge. And yet, here she was, bargaining away her humanity for the chance to finish what he had started. Mr. Albright slid the documents forward. "You both understand the terms. This marriage satisfies the legal requirement of the will. The inheritance will be released in full. Privately, you may set your own arrangement." Madeline stared at the pages, imagining her name scrawled in black ink, sealing her inside a life she had not chosen. A life where Sebastian's world, rigid, disciplined, silent, would become her cage. Her hand trembled as she reached for the pen. "Wait!" Sebastian's voice cut through the air. Low, commanding, impossible to ignore. Madeline froze, her eyes snapping to his. His face remained unreadable, but his tone carried weight. "If we do this," he said evenly, "there will be rules. Clear rules." Her brows drew together. "Rules. I work long hours. I need order, silence, discipline. I don't tolerate chaos. If you live under my roof, you will respect that." Defiance sparked in her chest. "And what about me? Do I get to have rules too?" For the briefest moment, something ghosted across his lips, not a smile of warmth, but recognition, as if he'd just seen a fire in her he hadn't expected. "Yes, say them." She straightened in her chair, her voice steadier now. "I will not be treated like a guest in my own life. I will not give up my studies, my freedom, or my dignity. I may live in your house, but I will not disappear into it." His eyes lingered on her. Though his expression remained controlled, a flicker crossed his gaze. Curiosity, maybe even a hint of respect. Mr. Albright cleared his throat gently, sensing the electricity between them. "Then we have an understanding." The rain tapped harder against the windows, steady and insistent, as though urging them to decide. Finally, Sebastian inclined his head once. An understanding. Madeline's pulse thundered as she picked up the pen. Each letter of her signature scratched across the paper like the sound of a door locking behind her. Sebastian followed, his signature bold and final. Mr. Albright gathered the documents with calm satisfaction. "It is done. The inheritance will be transferred within the month. By law, you are now husband and wife." The words fell heavy, sinking into the room like stones dropped into deep water. Madeline exhaled. Though it wasn't relief, what she felt was emptiness, as if she had traded one burden for another. Sebastian rose, movements precise. "You will move into my house by the end of the week." She blinked at him, startled. "That soon? There is no reason to delay." His tone left no room for discussion. Her lips parted, ready to argue, but she stopped. What was the point? This wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about choice. It was about survival. As she gathered her things, she felt Sebastian's gaze on her, Not cold, not cruel, but assessing, as if already calculating how she would fit, or fail to fit, into his world. The cab ride home blurred into streaks of city lights against rain-smeared glass. Madeline leaned her forehead to the window, her mind split between dread and something she couldn't quite define. She had bound her future to a man encased in ice. Yet deep inside, she sensed the faintest flicker of something else. Not hope, not yet, but possibility. A possibility she was too afraid to name. The mansion stood on the edge of Boston, perched above the Charles River like a sentinel carved in stone. Its tall windows reflected the pale winter light, its symmetry flawless, its presence imposing. From the street it was breathtaking, modern, sleek, precise. But as Madeline stepped out of the cab and tilted her head to take it in, the house felt less like a home and more like a fortress. The iron gates had swung open automatically at her arrival, the long driveway framed by hedges trimmed into perfection, trees bare and skeletal against the grey sky. The air smelled of wet stone and the metallic bite of the river. Hugging her coat closer, Madeline climbed the steps, her heartbeat heavy in her chest. Sebastian was already waiting in the doorway. His posture was straight, his suit dark, blending into the shadows of the hall behind him. No words of welcome, no attempt at warmth. He simply stepped aside, granting her entrance. The foyer swallowed her whole. Marble floors gleamed under recessed lights. The walls, painted in muted grey, stretched bare and lifeless. No photographs, no colour, no evidence of joy or family. It was a house designed for order, not for belonging. Her suitcase rattled against the polished stone, the sound unnervingly loud in the cavernous silence. She felt like an intruder, an unwelcome presence disturbing the balance. "This will be your home now," Sebastian said, his voice clipped, rehearsed. "Your room is upstairs, last door on the right. I trust it will be suitable." She nodded, words caught in her throat, and followed him up the staircase. Each step groaned faintly beneath their weight, amplifying the quiet that stretched between them. When he opened the door, she wasn't surprised. The room was spotless, functional, impersonal, white walls, a perfectly made bed, a desk placed with geometric precision by the window. It felt more like a hotel room than a sanctuary. Empty. She set her suitcase down. By the time she turned to thank him, Sebastian was already gone, the door clicking softly behind him. The first days in the mansion passed like a dream she couldn't wake from. Sebastian left before dawn, his schedule swallowed by surgeries, rounds and research. He returned late, often past midnight, a shadow of discipline slipping back through the door. Meals were quiet rituals. The housekeeper laid the table for two, but conversation was rare. Sebastian would sit, eat with mechanical efficiency, then vanish into his study, leaving Madeline alone with the tick of an antique clock in the vast dining room. And yet, in the silence, she began to notice the details. The invisible weight on his shoulders, the dark hollows beneath his eyes, the piano in the living room, its keys untouched, though its surface gleamed as if polished daily. On her third morning, she rose early, her bare feet cold against the tiles of the kitchen. A defiant thought crossed her mind. Then, without hesitation, she brewed coffee. The aroma cut through the sterile air, rich and grounding. When Sebastian entered, his precision faltered. He stopped, his gaze catching on the steaming mug she slid across the counter. "I thought you might need this," she said lightly, though her pulse raced. He hesitated, then took it. Their fingers nearly brushed. He raised the mug, inhaled, sipped. His expression didn't soften, but something shifted. A pause, a flicker. His eyes lingered on her for a fraction longer before he turned away. From that morning on, she brewed coffee daily. A small act, insignificant on the surface, but it became a ritual. Her rebellion against the lifeless mansion. In the evenings, she began leaving books scattered on the coffee table or placing fresh flowers into a vase she'd picked up on her way home from classes. Tiny bursts of life in a world painted grey. At first, Sebastian ignored them, but one evening, returning late, she saw him pause before the flowers. His eyes lingered there, thoughtful, before he moved on. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, weighted, alive, like the stillness before a storm. Words unsaid pressed between glances, and though she would never admit it, Madeline began to wonder if the mansion's walls, and the man who lived within them, could ever truly be broken. One night, closing her book in the living room, her eyes drifted to the hallway. The door to Sebastian's study was ajar. Warm light spilled through the gap, along with the faint rustle of turning pages. Madeline stood, her hand brushing the doorframe. Should she step inside? Should she break the silence? Before she could decide, the light shifted. Sebastian's shadow moved across the wall. It began with a chill. At first, Madeline dismissed it as nothing more than a draft sneaking through the mansion's tall windows or the weight of endless late-night study sessions. But by the end of the week, the heaviness in her body grew unbearable. Her throat burned, her skin flushed, and waves of fever pressed down on her until she could no longer pretend it was only fatigue. Still, she tried to push through. That morning she brewed coffee as always, though her hands trembled as she gripped the pot. The aroma, once comforting, made her stomach twist. She forced a smile when Sebastian entered the kitchen, but his eyes caught the way her shoulders sagged, the pallor in her skin. "You don't look well," he said, his voice flat, but his gaze sharper than usual. "I'm fine," she whispered, brushing it off. She reached for a mug, but her grip faltered. The cup slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. The sound cracked through the silence. Madeline froze, cheeks burning with shame. She opened her mouth to apologize, but before the words came, her knees buckled. In an instant, Sebastian was at her side. His hands, steady, skilled, the same hands trusted in delicate surgeries, caught her before she hit the ground. For the first time since she had known him, his composure fractured. Madeline. Her name was no longer formal, no longer distant. It carried urgency, fragility. She tried to respond, but her vision blurred. The fever pulled her under, and the world went black. When she woke, she wasn't on the cold floor, but tucked neatly into bed. A cool cloth pressed against her forehead, and the faint scent of broth drifted from a steaming bowl on the nightstand. Sebastian sat at the edge of her bed, sleeves rolled up, hair tousled from his hands. His tie was gone, his shirt rumpled, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. He looked nothing like the untouchable man she had seen these past weeks. He looked human. "You should have told me you were sick," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual edge. Madeline swallowed, her throat raw. "You had a surgery today. I didn't want to—" "I cancelled it," he cut in. Her eyes widened. "You cancelled a surgery? For me?" His gaze flickered away, as if reluctant to admit it. "I couldn't leave you like that." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. For a man who built his life on discipline, precision, and duty, this was unthinkable. Yet here he was, sitting at her bedside, spoon in hand, gently offering her broth. "Eat," he said, almost gruff, though his hand trembled slightly. Too weak to argue, Madeline obeyed. The warmth slid down her throat, easing the ache. But it wasn't the broth that steadied her, it was him. The surgeon who had seemed carved from stone now sat beside her, guarding her as though she were his most fragile patient. Through the night, fever dreams blurred reality. Each time she stirred, Sebastian was there. He changed the compress on her forehead, adjusted the blankets, even held her hand when the shivers grew violent. His thumb brushed her knuckles unconsciously, as though the contact steadied him as much as it did her. At one point she woke to find him leaning against the headboard, her hand still in his eyes closed, exhaustion softening the sharp edges of his face. For the first time, she wondered if the silence surrounding Sebastian wasn't strength, but loneliness so deep it had nearly hollowed him out. By dawn, the fever broke. Her skin was damp, her body weak, but the heaviness had lifted. Opening her eyes, she found Sebastian watching her, his expression intense enough to steal her breath. "You scared me," he admitted. The words were rough, torn from a place he rarely let anyone touch. Her heart stuttered. She had never expected to hear those words from him. "You don't have to care this much," she whispered. His jaw tightened, but his hand never left hers. "You are important," he said simply, as if the truth had been buried too long and refused to stay hidden. The room stilled. Only the tick of the clock filled the silence, blending with the fragile rhythm of two hearts beating closer than ever before. Madeline closed her eyes, not from fever, but from the realization that the walls around Sebastian Hale were not indestructible. They were beginning to crack, and she was the one holding the chisel. The invitation had arrived a week earlier, an annual gala for Boston's medical elite, a night where reputations gleamed, alliances were forged, and ambition paraded beneath chandeliers of crystal and gold. For Sebastian, it was nothing but an obligation, a performance of appearances. For Madeline, it was an unfamiliar world, one that glittered with elegance but pulsed with unspoken hierarchies. On the night of the gala, she stood before the mirror in her room, smoothing the emerald green gown she had reluctantly agreed to wear. The color deepened her eyes, warmed her skin, and transformed her into someone she barely recognized. The girl buried in textbooks and cafeterias now looked like she belonged in that dazzling, intimidating world. A knock broke her reflection. When she opened the door, Sebastian stood there in a black tuxedo that fit him with flawless precision. He looked like he had stepped out of a portrait, elegant, composed, untouchable, and yet, for the briefest moment, his eyes lingered on her longer than they should have before he turned away. "Are you ready?" he asked, voice steady, revealing nothing. The ride was quiet, the city lights streaming past like whispers. But once they entered the ballroom, silence gave way to a rush of music, laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, the air fragrant with roses and cologne. Heads turned, whispers followed. Sebastian Hale, the aloof neurosurgeon, had brought someone, and not just anyone, a young woman whose very presence drew attention. Madeline felt their eyes on her but lifted her chin, moving at Sebastian's side with as much composure as she could gather. His hand rested lightly at her back, guiding her through the crowd, a gesture subtle but protective, even if his face betrayed nothing. Then came Dr. Julian Brooks, charming, confident, his smile disarmed instantly as he bowed slightly toward her. "You must be Madeline," he said warmly. "Top of your class, I hear. Your grandfather spoke of you often." Her chest tightened. He did." Julian's expression softened. "He was proud of you, said you had his same fire." The sincerity in his tone disarmed her. For once, she wasn't a condition, an arrangement, or a burden. She was Madeline Harper, student, dreamer, granddaughter. Beside her, Sebastian stood silent, his jaw tightening, his eyes unreadable. The orchestra swelled into a waltz. Julian extended his hand. "May I have this dance?" Madeline hesitated, her gaze flicking instinctively to Sebastian. He said nothing, offered no sign. Her pulse quickened as she placed her hand in Julian's. On the dance floor, Julian's movements were easy, confident. "You're a natural," he teased when she stumbled. She laughed softly, the sound foreign to her own ears after so many weeks of silence. From the edge of the ballroom, Sebastian watched. His body was rigid, his gaze fixed. He told himself it was only a dance, but the sight of her laughing, her gown shimmering, another man's hand at her waist, it twisted something deep inside him, something sharp and unwelcome. When the song ended, Julian leaned closer, his voice low. "If you ever need someone to remind you that you're more than an arrangement, come find me." Madeline froze, caught between gratitude and unease. Before she could respond, a hand closed around her wrist. Sebastian. His grip was firm, his eyes burning with something she had never seen before. Possession, anger, perhaps even fear. Without a word, he pulled her from the floor. The crowd parted instinctively, whispers following them into the hallway. Away from the music in the quiet corridor, Sebastian turned, his breath sharp. "Do you enjoy making a spectacle of yourself?" His voice was low, but it trembled with emotion he could not contain. Madeline's eyes widened. "I was just dancing." "With him," Sebastian snapped. The mask cracked. "Do you have any idea what that looked like?" Her heart pounded. "What it looked like, or what it felt like," she whispered. For a heartbeat, his facade shattered. He raked a hand through his hair, his composure unraveling. "You distract me, Madeline. You unsettle me. You're my weakness." The confession hung between them like lightning in the air. Dangerous, undeniable. His voice had broken on the last word, as though dragged from a place he had buried too deep. Madeline's breath caught. Words failed her. The air pulsed with something alive, something forbidden. Inside the ballroom the music shifted, laughter rising again. But in the hallway, silence pressed between them. Two souls caught at the edge of something neither had prepared for. Sebastian's eyes flicked to her lips. His hand lingered near her wrist, torn between release and restraint. And then, with a suddenness that cut like glass, he turned away, walking down the corridor, leaving Madeline trembling in the silence. Not with fear, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous: hope. The days after the gala were steeped in silence, not the familiar silence of Sebastian's house, but one that was heavier, restless, charged with everything left unsaid. Madeline replayed that moment in the hallway again and again, his voice breaking when he called her his weakness, the fire in his eyes, the way he pulled away as if terrified of his own honesty. At breakfast, he barely looked at her. At night, he locked himself in his study, though sometimes she glimpsed him standing at the window, staring into the dark, as if searching for answers beyond his reach. The distance gnawed at her, but beneath it, she knew. A crack had split the armor. One night, unable to sleep, Madeline wandered into the living room. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting soft gold across the room. She sat on the rug, pulling her knees to her chest, breathing in the warmth. For once, the mansion didn't feel cold. She didn't hear him come in until his reflection flickered in the glass cabinet. Sebastian stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled to his forearms, shadows carved deep under his eyes. "You should be asleep," he murmured. Madeline lifted her gaze. "So should you." Neither moved. Then he stepped into the room, standing by the fire. His presence filled the space, strong yet fragile, his fists clenched as if holding on to something unseen. Her voice was steady, though her heart raced. "Why did you say it that night, that I was your weakness?" His jaw tightened, his eyes stayed on the flames. "Because it's the truth." Her chest tightened at the rawness in his tone. "And why is that so terrible?" This time he turned sharply, his eyes finding hers. No mask, no walls, only fear. Naked, unrestrained. "Because I don't know how to feel without losing control," he confessed, his voice breaking. "My life has always been order. Precision. Control is how I save lives. It's how I survive myself. And you—" He dragged a hand through his hair, as though the words themselves cut him. "You dismantle that. Every time you laugh, every time you look at me like you see something I can't hide. I lose myself." Madeline rose slowly, her pulse hammering. She moved closer, her gaze steady on his. "Sebastian, maybe losing yourself isn't the worst thing." He shook his head, trembling. "You don't understand. I can face death on an operating table without flinching, but the thought of losing you, of loving you, terrifies me more than anything I've ever known." Her breath caught. His confession wasn't dressed as romance. It was raw fear. He wasn't declaring love. He was admitting that love itself was his undoing. She stepped closer until the firelight washed across his face, softening the lines carved deep by solitude. Her hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed against his cheek. "Then let yourself be terrified," she whispered, "because you're not the only one." His breath hitched at her touch. For a moment, time stilled, the flames crackling, their emotions suspended. And then, as though something inside him finally shattered, Sebastian closed the distance. His lips crashed against hers in a kiss that was at once desperate and restrained, a war between years of repression and a flood of longing. Madeline clung to him, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body answering his with a need she could no longer contain. The kiss deepened, hungry, breaking down every wall he had built brick by brick. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how to do this." Madeline's lips curved into a trembling smile, tears pricking her eyes. "Then we'll figure it out together." Adim, the fire roared, its light spilling over two people who had lived in silence and solitude, now bound by something neither could deny. Yet even in that warmth, shadows lingered. For if love had the power to heal, it also had the power to destroy. And neither of them yet knew which it would be. The mansion was no longer silent. Where once only footsteps and the ticking of clocks had filled the air, now laughter floated through the halls. The piano, once untouched, carried soft melodies into the evenings. Fresh flowers brightened the rooms, and the aroma of coffee greeted each morning. It was as if Madeline had breathed life into stone. Sebastian, though hesitant at first, began to accept the changes. His routines remained sharp, his discipline intact, but there were cracks, gentle ones, that revealed something more. He lingered longer at breakfast, listening to her stories from class. He would pause in the kitchen doorway, simply watching her hum as she cooked, a faint smile tugging at his lips without him realizing. And in the evenings, when the exhaustion of the hospital clung to him, Madeline was there. She curled against him on the couch as old movies played, her head resting on his shoulder. Sometimes, when he allowed himself to forget the weight of the world, he would pull her closer and press a kiss to her hair, grounding himself in her presence. For Madeline, these were the happiest days she had ever known. She discovered the man behind the surgeon, his dry humor surfacing when fatigue loosened his guard. The gentleness in the way his thumb traced circles against her hand, the rare, unguarded laugh that lit his face like sunlight breaking through clouds. She was falling in love, not with the man the world admired, but with the one hidden behind walls only she had learned to breach. For the first time, she felt her grandfather's condition had not condemned her, but guided her toward something she never would have chosen herself, a love worth everything. But with joy came fear. Sebastian's heart was slower to surrender. Though he gave her smiles, kisses, and tenderness, shadows still lingered in his eyes. Something unspoken lived there, a constant weight beneath the surface. One evening, after a long day, he returned late. His tie was loose, his shoulders heavy. Madeline had been waiting, curled up with a book, and leapt to her feet the moment he walked in. "You're home," she said softly, relief brightening her face as she reached for his hand. He let her hold it, but his gaze slid past hers. Without a word, he walked toward the study. "Sebastian?" she called, worry threading her voice. He paused at the door, his back still to her. Silence stretched long enough to sting. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy. You make me happy in ways I never thought possible, Madeline. Her heart fluttered at the words. Then why do you sound like that's a bad thing? He turned, his expression shadowed. Because happiness means I have something to lose, and I don't know if I can survive that. The confession pierced her, not for its cruelty, but its honesty. Sebastian Hale, the man of precision and control, was unraveling under the weight of love. Madeline stepped closer, her voice tender but steady. You're not alone anymore. That's the point of this, of us. But even as she spoke, she saw it, the flicker of fear he couldn't silence. His hand rose to her cheek, trembling faintly as he whispered, You are my everything, and that terrifies me. That night, lying beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breath, Madeline's heart ached with both joy and unease. She was loved, deeply, wholly, perhaps more than she had ever dreamed. Yet she felt the storm inside him, the fragile line between devotion and fear, and the question whispered in her mind, one she could not push away. Would Sebastian's love be the force that saved them both, or the very thing that broke them apart? The hospital's operating theatre had always been Sebastian's sanctuary. Inside those sterile white walls, beneath the harsh light of the surgical lamps, he was untouchable. Every movement of his hands, every decision, every heartbeat, precise, deliberate, flawless. For years, it was the one place where his world made sense, but lately even here, he felt invaded. Scalpel in hand, eyes on the patient before him, Sebastian's mind betrayed him. Instead of the delicate web of nerves and vessels, he saw Madeline's smile shimmering in the reflection of his instruments. He heard her laughter in the steady beep of the monitors. He felt her hand in his, as though she were standing beside him. A tremor rippled through his chest. For the first time in his career, his focus cracked. "Dr. Hale?" His assistant's voice broke sharply into the room. Sebastian forced himself back, hands steady, mask in place. He finished the procedure flawlessly, as always. But when he stripped off his gloves and stared at his hands, they no longer felt like the tools of certainty he had built his life upon. They felt compromised. That evening, when he walked through the mansion doors, Madeline was waiting with news. Her eyes were alight, cheeks flushed with triumph. She held a letter in her hands like it was the key to the future. "I did it, Sebastian!" she exclaimed, her voice bubbling with joy. "I passed my exams. I'm graduating. Grandpa would be so proud." Her joy was radiant, filling the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. But Sebastian's face was shadowed, his chest rising and falling under the weight of something darker. Madeline's smile faltered. "You should be celebrating with me." Instead, his words fell like ice. "We can't do this anymore." Her laughter died in her throat. The paper slipped from her fingers. "What?" He turned away, unable to face her. "You are my greatest weakness. Today, in the operating room, I lost focus because of you. Do you understand? A patient's life was in my hands, and my mind wasn't on the scalpel. It was on you. That cannot happen. Ever." Her throat tightened, tears burning her eyes. "Sebastian, you're human. You're allowed to feel." He shook his head, his voice cutting through the room like steel. "No, not me. My life doesn't allow distractions. Everything I am, everything I've built, is discipline and control. And you—" His voice broke, his eyes betraying the truth. He wasn't angry at her. He was terrified of himself. "You undo me." Her heart cracked at the words. "So what are you saying? That you'd rather live alone in silence than risk loving me?" His silence was his answer. Madeline stepped back, her chest hollow, her voice trembling. "I thought you were different. I thought you were brave enough to fight for something real." The words hit him harder than any scalpel wound, but he stood rigid, refusing to crumble. With tears streaking her cheeks, Madeline gathered her things. She didn't beg, didn't plead. She simply walked past him, her footsteps echoing through the vast emptiness of the mansion. The front door closed with a sound that split Sebastian's chest like a fracture. Alone once more, he collapsed into the armchair by the fire, burying his face in his hands. The silence returned, but it no longer felt like order. It felt like suffocation. Meanwhile, Madeline sought refuge at Natalie's apartment. Her closest friend, her anchor. The small, cluttered space overflowed with warmth. Books piled on tables, photos pinned crookedly to the walls, laughter lingering in every corner. Natalie wrapped her in a blanket, held her as she cried and whispered, "You can't fix a man who doesn't want to be saved." Madeline nodded, though her heart screamed otherwise. Sebastian didn't need saving, he needed courage. Courage to risk, courage to love, courage to let go of control. And as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, one question circled relentlessly in her mind. Had she truly lost him forever? Or was this only the beginning of the battle neither of them yet knew how to fight? The mansion had returned to silence. Not the charged silence that once pulsed with tension when Madeline was there, but a hollow one, merciless, suffocating. The coffee pot sat untouched in the mornings. The vases were empty, their flowers long gone. The piano gathered dust again. Every room felt colder, wider, stripped of the fragile warmth she had breathed into it. Sebastian told himself it was necessary, that he had done the right thing, that he had protected his work, his patience, his discipline. He convinced himself that solitude was safety, that love was weakness. But solitude had never felt so much like drowning. At the hospital, his hands remained steady, his record flawless. To the outside world, he was still the same Sebastian Hale, brilliant, unshakable. Yet every incision, every stitch carried her ghost. During one operation, just as he navigated the fragile tissue of the brain, his vision blurred for the briefest instant. And in that flash, he didn't see his patient. He saw Madeline, her eyes shining with tears, walking away from him. His breath faltered, panic ripped through him. He finished the surgery flawlessly, but afterward he locked himself in his office. Alone, for the first time in years, Sebastian pressed his hands to his face and admitted the truth he had been running from. He hadn't been in control since the day Madeline Harper entered his life. Meanwhile, Madeline tried to carve a life outside the mansion's walls. Natalie's apartment was cramped but alive, books stacked high, photographs tilted at odd angles, laughter embedded in every corner. They cooked together, studied together. Natalie did everything she could to fill the void. But at night, when the city hummed outside the window, Madeline lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her chest ached with a question she couldn't silence. Was he awake too? Did he miss her? The truth was, he did. More than he had ever missed anyone. One stormy night, Sebastian left the hospital, his body exhausted but his soul restless. His car waited in the garage, but he couldn't drive home. Home was emptiness. Home was suffocation. Instead, he walked. Rain lashed against him, soaking through his clothes, plastering his hair to his forehead. Each step pounded with one truth: he couldn't live another day without her. By the time he reached Natalie's building, his hands were trembling from cold, but his chest burned with something fiercer than the storm. He rang the buzzer once, twice. No answer. Desperation overtook him. He pounded on the door, his voice breaking. "Madeline!" Inside, she startled, nearly spilling her tea. Natalie rushed to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Her eyes widened. "It's him!" Madeline's heart stopped. For a moment, she froze, torn between anger and longing. But then his voice rose again, raw and broken, stripped of every wall. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, carrying her to the door. She opened it, and the sight stole her breath. Sebastian stood drenched, rain streaming down his face, his chest heaving. His eyes, those eyes that had always been stone, were shattered, pleading. "I can't," he said, his voice ragged. "I can't do this without you." Tears blurred her vision. "Sebastian!" He stepped closer, his hands shaking as though afraid she might disappear if he touched her. "I thought control would save me. I thought pushing you away would protect us. But I was wrong. The truth is," his voice cracked, breaking under the storm. "The truth is, I don't have control anymore." "You're the one thing I can't fight, and I don't want to." Madeline's lips parted, her heart aching with every word. The man who had built his life on walls was standing before her in ruins, offering the confession she had longed to hear. Rain hammered harder, thunder rolling like a witness to his plea. "Please," Sebastian whispered, his voice trembling, "come back to me. I don't care how, I don't care what it takes. I can't breathe without you." The world held its breath. Madeline's hand hovered, torn between the wounds of the past and the truth she could no longer deny. And as she met his desperate gaze, she knew one thing with certainty. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a storm they would have to face together. The night of the storm had left them raw, fragile, yes, but bound in a way that neither could deny. After Sebastian's desperate confession at Natalie's door, Madeline had let him in, into her friend's apartment, into her arms, into the fragile space of forgiveness she hadn't known she still carried. They spoke for hours in hushed voices, the rain bearing witness. For the first time, Sebastian spoke not as the surgeon, not as the man of control, but as someone stripped of armor, trembling yet sincere. For the first time, Madeline truly believed he was ready to fight for them. But fate was never gentle. 2 nights later, Sebastian left the hospital after another grueling surgery. The city pulsed with ordinary life. Traffic humming, sirens wailing distantly, the glow of neon lights reflected in puddles on the street. His steps were slow, his briefcase loose in his grip, exhaustion carved into his features. His thoughts were already with Madeline, with the dinner waiting, with her laughter echoing in his mind like a balm. He never saw the figure emerge from the shadows. The sound came sharp and sudden, metal against glass, a muffled cry, and then chaos. Sebastian's body struck the pavement, his head hitting hard. The world spun, dissolved into darkness. The call reached Madeline just as she was setting the table. The words slammed into her chest: accident, head trauma, critical. Her knees nearly buckled, the phone trembling in her hands. She ran. She didn't remember the cab ride, the streets blurring past. Only the hospital, the fluorescent lights stabbing her eyes, the antiseptic sting in the air, the rush of gurneys and clipped voices. And then she saw him. Sebastian lay pale and still, his head swathed in bandages, tubes trailing from his arms, machines breathing rhythm into him where his own strength faltered. Madeline's breath broke into sobs. She clutched the rail of his bed, whispering, "No. Please, no." The attending surgeon spoke in calm, clinical tones, trauma, swelling, uncertain prognosis. But none of it registered. All she heard was her own heartbeat, the silence of his, and the whisper of her grandfather's voice in memory. Love requires courage, even when it hurts. So she stayed. She refused to leave, even when nurses urged her to rest. She held his hand, whispered stories into the sterile air, spoke of the promises they had made, the future still waiting. Her tears dampened the sheets, but her grip never faltered. "Come back to me, Sebastian," she begged in the long hours of the night. "You don't get to leave me. Not now, not after everything." Time blurred. Days and nights became indistinguishable. Only the rise and fall of his chest, tethering her to hope. She slept in fragments, her head against the mattress beside him, her body aching but her resolve unbroken. And then, one morning, his fingers moved. Madeline jerked upright, her breath catching. She leaned close, her heart pounding. "Sebastian, can you hear me?" A faint groan left his lips, eyelids fluttering. Slowly, painfully, his eyes opened, hazy but alive. When his gaze found hers, relief shattered her composure. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "You're here. Thank God you're here." His voice was hoarse, a rasp dragged from deep within. "Madeline." He swallowed each word heavy. "You stayed." Her hands clutched his. "Of course I stayed. Where else would I be?" His eyes blurred with tears, not of pain, but of something far deeper. In that fragile moment, the walls he had fought to preserve collapsed entirely. "You taught me," he whispered, his voice trembling, "that love isn't weakness. It's the only reason life is worth living." Madeline pressed her forehead against his, her tears mingling with his own. For the first time, there were no masks, no silence, no walls, only truth. And in that humming hospital room, love itself became the force that pulled him back from the edge. Yet even as relief washed over them both, a shadow lingered like a question neither dared to speak. Would this brush with tragedy change him forever? Or would the ghosts of fear and control return, demanding their price once more? Spring arrived in Boston like a breath of renewal. The air was softer, the trees finally draped in green, and the university campus pulsed with the excitement of soon-to-be graduates. Among them, Madeline Harper walked proudly in her black gown and cap, diploma in hand, her heart overflowing. In the crowded auditorium, applause rose like a wave, but for her the only sound that mattered was the pair of hands clapping louder, stronger, more devoted than all the rest. Sebastian was there. Still recovering from the accident, his steps were careful, but the trace of fragility in his body only magnified the fierce steadiness in his gaze. When their eyes met across the sea of faces, Madeline felt every trial, every tear, every moment of fear had led her here, to this instant. Later, in the quiet of the university garden, he waited beneath the shade of an old oak. The afternoon light spilled golden across the grass as Madeline approached, her diploma still pressed to her chest. "Your grandfather would be proud," Sebastian said, his voice low, certain. "And so am I." Before she could answer, he drew a small velvet box from his pocket. Her breath caught. Her heart stumbled. "Last year we signed a contract," Sebastian began, his voice unsteady but full. "It was practical, cold, empty, but somewhere along the way you broke through every wall I built. You gave me more than love. You gave me life again. And now I don't want rules or contracts or conditions. I just want you, all of you, for as long as you'll have me." He opened the box. The ring gleamed, but not half as brightly as his eyes. Tears welled in Madeline's own as her hands flew to her mouth. "Madeline Harper," he said, lowering himself carefully onto one knee, despite the strain, his gaze locked to hers. "Will you marry me? For real this time?" She didn't hesitate. Dropping to her knees, she wrapped her arms around him in an embrace that said more than words ever could. "Yes," she whispered against his chest, her voice breaking with joy. 1,000 times yes. 6 months later, the mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. Its walls bloomed with photographs, vases brimmed with fresh flowers, and the piano sang. Not silence, but the tentative melodies Madeline practiced with laughter and determination. One morning, her hands trembling, she approached Sebastian with a shy smile. "Sebastian, I'm pregnant." For a moment, he froze, as if the world itself had paused. Then slowly, he sank to his knees before her, tears slipping freely down his face, tears he had once sworn never to let fall. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted," he whispered, his voice breaking. "A home, a family, a love that's real." Madeline threaded her fingers through his hair, her heart beating with the truth of it. And in that house that had once been nothing but walls of stone and silence, a new life began, born not of contracts or conditions, but of love that had endured fear, loss, and time itself. That night, as Madeline gazed through the window at the star-strewn sky, she thought of her grandfather. Charles Harper had always said that the human heart wasn't just meant to pump blood. It was meant to carry hope, to carry love, to carry new beginnings. And now, with Sebastian's hand in hers and the future stirring within her, she finally understood. Because in the end, his greatest legacy was not only the life he built as a healer, it was the love that lived on in them.